George Martin had worked with hundreds of artists, but only 4 young men from Liverpool ever truly changed his life. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were no longer just a band he produced. They were a phenomenon he had to interpret, protect, and sometimes translate into sound. And among all the songs they recorded, there was one George Martin kept returning to in interviews, books, and conversations. Not because it was the biggest hit, not because it was the most complex, but because it revealed who the Beatles were becoming. That song was A Day in the Life.
I read the news today, oh boy.
When John Lennon brought the first draft of A Day in the Life to the studio in early 1967, George Martin immediately sensed something different. It wasn't a normal song. It had no clear structure, no obvious chorus, just fragments of news, memory, and dreamlike observation. Martin later recalled that Lennon didn't explain it much. He simply played it, almost casually, as if unsure whether it even worked. But Martin heard something extraordinary. It wasn't a song, he said. It was a window into John's mind. What fascinated George Martin most was how the song combined 2 completely different voices. John Lennon's verses were detached, surreal, and distant, inspired by newspaper headlines and his growing sense of emotional disconnection. Then suddenly, Paul McCartney's section burst in, brisk, grounded, almost mundane. Woke up, fell out of bed? To many producers, this would have sounded like a mistake. To Martin, it was genius. He often spoke about how A Day in the Life captured the duality of the Beatles better than any other track. John's introspection and Paul's everyday realism colliding inside the same song. The moment George Martin talked about most, however, was the orchestra. Lennon wanted the sound of the universe expanding. Paul wanted chaos with purpose. No one could fully explain what that meant, except that it had never been done before. Martin took the risk. He hired a full orchestra and told them to start at the lowest note of their instrument and climb to the highest, each at their own pace. It could have failed spectacularly. Instead, it became one of the most iconic moments in recording history. Martin later admitted, "I didn't know if it would work, but I trusted them, and they trusted me." In later years, George Martin was often asked about his proudest moment with the Beatles. He mentioned many songs, but A Day in the Life came up again and again, not because it was polished, but because it was brave. It broke the rules of pop music. It confused radio stations. It scared record executives. And yet, Martin believed it proved something essential, that the Beatles were no longer following music, they were reshaping it. George Martin often said that after A Day in the Life, the recording studio was no longer just a place to capture performances. It became an instrument. That idea, now taken for granted, was radical in 1967, and Martin knew exactly where it began. "With that song," he once said, "we stopped recording music as it was and started imagining what it could be." A Day in the Life was not the Beatles' most commercial song. It wasn't meant to be easy. It wasn't meant to be comfortable. That's why George Martin never stopped talking about it. Because in that song, he didn't just hear a band at its peak. He heard 4 artists stepping into the unknown, and a producer brave enough to walk with them. And for George Martin, that was the moment the Beatles became timeless.